You are listening to Radio Maria Canada. We now present the Health Hub, hosted by Cathy Biase.
Welcome to the Health Hub on Radio Maria Canada, exploring cutting-edge health and wellness information and therapies, helping you to take your health to the next level. I'm your host, Cathy Biase, and I'm an holistic nutritionist and a professional cancer coach. With all of the health information available to us, why are so many high-performing, health-conscious people still feeling exhausted, foggy, and like their bodies are working against them? What if the real problem isn't your hormones, your diet, or even your workouts, but something happening much deeper at the cellular level? Today's guest is changing the way we think about aging, energy, and performance. Dr. Will Haas is a board-certified physician in Integrative and Family Medicine and the founder and CEO of VYVE Wellness. His work focuses on cellular optimization, helping high-achieving individuals reclaim their energy, sharpen their focus, and actually feel younger, not just look it. Through advanced therapies like peptides, IV nutrients, hyperbaric oxygen, and redlight therapy, he's uncovering what most conventional approaches completely miss. On our show today, we are talking about the hidden cellular breakdown that accelerates aging and why upgrading your health strategy may be the key to sustaining success long term. We will be back in just a few minutes to start our conversation with Dr. Will Haas.
You are listening to Radio Maria Canada. We now continue with the program, The Health Hub, hosted by Cathy Biase.
Welcome back to the Health Hub. Please follow us on our social sites. We are on Instagram, X, and Facebook, and we are at the Health Hub RMC on those locations. Will, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Cathy.
I think it's a really interesting, forward-thinking area of medicine that you are in, one that many of us don't know. So as we go through the show, we're going to get deeper into this, but I think it's a good idea to, your longevity, this is your expertise area, and we're all chasing longevity one way or another. But are we focusing, in your opinion, on the wrong areas of health?
I think it depends who you talk to. I think some of us, yes, and some of us, no, right? If we're thinking about longevity framed as solely anti-aging vanity metrics or simply extending lifespan, then I think we are chasing the wrong things, right? But if they're thinking about extending health span and performance, right? So how long we can live at these high areas of high performing, then I think we're starting to think about the right things, especially if that's framed from the context of things like mitochondrial health and metabolic flexibility and protecting muscle mass and reducing inflammation and keeping the brain sharp as the body is capable, and all that for as long as possible. So I think if we're thinking it from that mindset, then we're definitely thinking about it the right way.
So when you talk about high performance, are you working specifically with high-level athletes, people that are pushing health beyond, the general populace?
Yeah, I think high performance can look different for every individual. And I think that's probably a theme that's going to come up in our conversation today is I'm going to say it depends and it's different, and because it all depends on who's sitting in front of me. I have a wide variety of patients, and that's one of the things I love about my my practice is, I have NFL players, I have patients on fertility journeys, on cancer journeys, I have, the 40-year-olds who are high performance to them is being able to keep up with work-life balance, right? It's to be able to put their 40 to 60 hours of work in to come home and not feel fried, exhausted for their family and not feel like they're losing control of their body and gaining weight and not sleeping well. So that can look very different for every individual.
Now, would you say, are individuals that have exhausted other areas of health and are just not getting to the level that they want to be at?
By and large, I'd say yes. Now, that can be for a couple different reasons. One, that can be, unfortunately, the standard of conventional medicine does not often provide the answers that they're looking for, especially when you fall in this gray zone of, you don't have overt disease and you still don't feel well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times don't feel well is just kind of brushed off to, you know, stop stressing, get more
Mm-hmm.
sleep, right? But that does nothing to look at what's happening at the true cellular level, right? You're starting to lose metabolic flexibility. Your mitochondria are starting to not function as optimally, so you're not producing as much energy, which translates to that brain fog, despite 8 hours of sleep. So I think a large part has to do with people wanting to do the right things and conventional medicine not having the answers. And there's already dysfunction happening at a cellular level that conventional medicine doesn't really know how to look for and address.
Well, what do you mean at the cellular level? What exactly are you talking about for people who are not new or that are new to this?
Yeah, so I think in context of things that people may have heard about or can associate with is going to be things such as inflammatory load, right? So how much inflammation is going on in the body? I'm thinking like micronutrient deficiencies, mitochondrial dysfunction, cells that produce ATP or energy, or a dysfunction of your immune cells, the ability of the immune system to kind of regulate and then communicate with cells that are responsible for balancing and clearing inflammation. So it's kind of these underlying drivers to optimal health. The balance between inflammation and inflammation resolving, the balance between oxidative stress and what we call the state of redox, reducing this oxidative stress, the state of metabolic flexibility where your cells know how to take in nutrients and process it and not store it as body fat or, struggle with insulin resistance. So that's kind of painting the picture of when I talk about cellular health.
So people that are high performing, and that are feeling exhausted and foggy and inflamed, and they feel that they're doing everything right, how do they get led to you?
A lot of it, I think people, it's kind of funny. The way I kind of got into this space of integrative cellular medicine was really looking at prevention and optimization of health and human performance. The only really place that spoke about that early in my medical training was the field of integrative medicine. Later along came functional medicine. And so, look, I think most people now know that they kind of start searching for the integrative or functional medicine, they'll kind of get into the world of a practitioner who's going to start speaking this language. Now, cellular medicine is, you know, almost a whole nother offshoot, right? One of
Mm-hmm.
my mentors, Dr. Bill Seeds, is kind of pioneering that space. So it's not just about mind body connections or food as medicine. It's really getting down to what's happening, at the cellular level and the way cells communicate with one another and how that leads to dysfunction.
Well, we have a lot of doctors come on the show and integrative practitioners that are really focused on hormonal health. And this area of brain fog, exhaustion, and not really getting an answer to the question pops up frequently in women's health. When you talk about cellular health and improving cellular health, how would that or could that impact hormonal health? Or are the two, do they cross sect?
I think that's one piece of the puzzle. I can't tell you how many times I'll have patients who have kind of gone down the road and path of working with an integrative or functional practitioner and had their hormones addressed, yet they still don't feel well,
Mhm.
right? They're still foggy or they're still gaining weight. And hormones is just one piece of the overall puzzle and kind of the bigger symphony that's happening and the balance that's happening. So, you know, are hormones essential for metabolism? Absolutely. But, you know, are the cells struggling with insulin resistance? That could be why we're kind of gaining weight despite hormones looking normal. Are cells, capable not only of kind of using insulin, but are they receptive to nutrients, right? So are the mitochondria primed to make use of the nutrients that the system has, or are they just deficient in key nutrients to support metabolism? So there can be a lot of different areas that all kind of have to work in sync in combination. That's usually what I find with patients in my practice is it's very infrequent that it's one thing, just like hormones, or it's, you know, struggle gaining weight, just jump on a GLP-1, right? It's usually multiple different things kind of happening. I'm constantly working with patients trying to move 5 or 6 dials all at once and not just crank one dial up as loud as I can.
Is there testing involved that, if someone comes into you wanting to be a patient, are there standard tests that you recommend or that you need in order to gauge what is going on?
Almost always, and it can be helpful, but it's going to be one part what are standard tests looking at these areas of cellular health, but then there's also going to be what's unique to the patient and the patient's story. All right, so some commonalities that I'm always going to look at are things that we discussed already. I'm going to be looking for key micronutrient deficiencies and going beyond the basics of vitamin D and B12, right? I'm going to be looking at markers for oxidative stress. What are glutathione levels? What are cysteine levels and glycine levels to make then glutathione? Be looking for a battery of other B vitamins, be it folate and B3. Looking at amino acids. So that can be kind of one area. Inflammatory markers. So high sensitivity CRP, homocysteine, maybe even IL-6, some of the interleukins to kind of look at inflammation and how that's operating in the body. I will look at hormones. You did kind of brought that up earlier. That is, I think, foundational. Do you need to take a look at those? And those are just some kind of key areas. Now it may get a little more personalized. So if I have an individual who's saying that they have brain fog and they also feel bloating after they eat and they're constipated or struggling with bouts of constipation diarrhea, then we may need to go look at their gut. So I'd say there's a good battery of standard tests some of which I've mentioned, and then there's others that make it a little bit more specific and precise depending on the patient story.
Okay. Excuse me. Um, when it comes to optimal health, is cellular optimization foundational, would you say, to good health? Is this something that's been overlooked and, maybe the missing piece for a lot of people? Is this where we should be going first?
I think where we should, I guess it depends on in terms of evaluation and prescription, right? So I almost pull those two apart. So I definitely think it needs to be one of the areas where we go first when we're evaluating our patients, or at least it needs to be part of the evaluation.
Okay.
Whereas I don't want to get that kind of mixed with when you actually start creating a diagnostic or a therapeutic treatment plan. All right. I'm going to
Mhm.
tell you that some of the tools that I use in my practice may be secondary to the lifestyle changes. All right. So to optimize cellular health, we cannot and should not forget the foundations of health. All right. So food is medicine, appropriate sleep, managing stress, and the importance of kind of deep connections with one another. Regulating circadian rhythms with the appropriate morning sunlight and minimizing blue light at night. These are all going to be foundational interventions that are going to help optimize to cells to perform optimally. And without that, then we can talk about things like peptides and stem cells and
Hmm.
hyperbaric oxygen. But if we're getting those foundational interventions off, it doesn't kind of matter.
Well, what would you say an optimized cell is?
It's one that has an ability to kind of sense the environment and respond appropriately. So kind of an example is that it's able to kind of sense that it is getting the right stimulus and responding the right way. So like good example I could probably pull is from this concept of nutrient sensing and this concept of a growth phase and a repair recycle phase in cellular health. And that's one lever is AMPK and the other lever is mTOR, right? So mTOR gets activated to help the cells grow and build and multiply. And it senses when we have states of excess food or nutrients around. The cells kind of kick into a growth state. But if you stay in that growth state, you don't have balance. That's when dysfunction starts to arise. All right, and then you kind of need this kind of yin and yang where you have the AMPK lever, which is more of kind of the opposite of the mTOR, where you're starting to kind of recycle the cell or enter the phases of what we call autophagy and let the cell kind of turn over and repair itself and kind of go out of this constant growth phase. And it's really just kind of finding that balance. And so optimal cellular health is really gets between the cell being able to kind of balance its kind of two functions. And that's just an example of these kind of two different functions a cell can have.
And how do you equate this with someone coming into your office and saying this is key for longevity? Like what are the misconceptions people come into your office with? And then how do you explain optimizing cellular health as key to what they're actually looking for?
I think some of the misconceptions is kind of jumping to some of the sexy tools, if you will, that you hear on social media, right? Where it's like, oh, I think one area you see that commonly right now is peptide therapy, right? Where I
Hmm.
see people using peptides, quite frankly, the same way they would use conventional medicine and prescriptive medications, right? Sometimes my patients will come to me and they're very anti-prescription medication, yet we're using peptides the same way, right? Which is you just kind of throw a band-aid on the solution, which is like, oh, I'm having hair loss. Well, let me try this peptide called GHK copper because somebody online told me that's going to help
Hmm.
my hair grow. Well, you have to take a step back and say, well, what's fundamental to the cell where the hair follicle is not healthy to grow, right? Are we missing things like zinc and iron and collagen proteins? Are we super inflamed, right? Is there a lot of inflammation kind of going in the body? Are we super stressed? Have we recently got hit with a bunch of infections, right? Recent infection with flu or COVID or something of that nature, where now the immune system's out of balance, right? So it's ultimately kind of going back and looking at those fundamental pieces before just throwing the latest wellness or biohacking trend at it. And so I think that's one area that I see people kind of commonly get off track with.
Hmm. What would you say are top three, let's say, cellular blind spots that accelerate aging and fatigue? Again, this is probably so much information that is new for people. Um, what would you say are the blind spots, things that we don't know about, things that are affecting us that we're just not seeing?
Probably one that jumps to mind first is going to be toxins.
Hmm.
Um, Would be that kind of a common area is environmental toxins. Some of the scary statistics out there is, almost 50% of, buildings in the US are thought to have water damage and mold.
Yeah.
And so we're just kind of living and breathing these mycotoxins in our system. And once in our system, they get deposited into our cells and into our tissue and kind of stay. They don't easily kind of aren't easily mobilized out. And then that will then have a domino effect where it starts to affect many of the areas of cellular health we talked about, right? That's going to dysregulate your immune system. It's going to uncouple and disrupt energy production in your mitochondrial cells. Because it's dysregulating your immune system, it's going to be kicking off inflammation, right? And that inflammation is then going to make mitochondria function worse. So you're producing less energy. So now suddenly, kind of the system starts compounding on itself, and you end up feeling tired and having brain fog and gaining weight and having weird joint pains that you go to your conventional doctor or and then everything kind of looks normal on your labs. So environmental toxins is definitely kind of one blind spot that I see quite frequently. Another one's going to be we kind of touched on it, micronutrient deficiencies, right? A lot of patients will come in and say, I eat clean, I eat healthy, shopping organic, or I'm going to the local farmers market. And that's great. That's fantastic. I think we should be doing those things as much as we can where we can, but that doesn't negate the fact that our soil quality is so much different than it was 2, 3 decades ago, right? And the nutrient deficiencies that we have even in quote, clean eating and healthy foods is still present. You layer on top of the fact that you maybe have some gut dysfunction and you're not absorbing some of those nutrients, right? We're going to be primed to be missing key nutrients. And I see that all the time. And I definitely spend more time doing advanced micronutrient testing with my patients. And I see that. And that will end up correlating quite well to some of the dysfunction with their immune system or their mitochondrial cells, or, an example with the inflammation that I'll commonly see is, you have an imbalance of your omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids, right? And your omega-3s are the fatty acids that are designed to basically help turn off inflammation pathways. And your omega-6 is kind of upregulate the inflammation pathways. There's more to it, obviously, but that's just kind of an example of where micronutrient deficiencies show up in cellular health patterns in the case that we have when we talked about inflammation. So environmental toxins, micronutrient deficiencies being a second one. And, a third one, we don't quite have as good of direct testing and measurement, but I think a lot of this chronic fatigue that we see a lot of has a lot to do with mitochondrial health and not just hormones or not just a B12 deficiency. Just the fact that the constant stress and the inability for the cells to reduce that stress means we don't produce as much energy, which then has a domino effect. So those are kind of three cellular blind spots, if you will.
Okay, great. And just before we go to our break, I'm going to ask a question that may really show my naivety with this whole area. You've talked a lot about mitochondrial cells. They are our energy sources. But when you're talking about cellular health, are you talking about cells all over the body, or are you specifically targeting certain areas of cellular health? I'm not sure if that's coming across properly.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay.
And I think that depends on the pattern that's sitting in front of me. And what my mentor would say, basically phenotyping the dysfunction, which is what group of cells are not functioning optimally. Is your immune cells, right? Not just the mitochondrial cells, right? So some of the problem could be the fact that the immune system can't appropriately balance itself, and it's kicking off too much inflammation and inflammatory pathways, and then they kind of feed off one another. So it's not just about these cells that produce ATP or energy, but how these different groups of cells all work in concert with one another.
So protocols will be based on, as you say, the phenotype that come across your desk from your client versus a whole body sort of detox. Does that make sense?
100%, right?
Okay.
So I'm not going to approach every patient some of the same. So we may look at some of the core foundational lab testing and diagnostic markers in the beginning, but uh, ultimately, it's kind of the patient's story and the pattern, and using some more advanced testing when needed to start to tease apart what's driving the dysfunction that comes across as the symptoms, that comes across as that brain fog, that comes across as that weight gain, that comes across as that joint pain. And there could be totally different patterns for every one of those patients with those symptoms.
Okay, great. Okay, let's take a break here. When we come back, we're going to dive deeper into perhaps some protocols that are common with patients. We'll see where it leads us. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
You are listening to The Health Hub here on Radio Maria Canada, a Catholic voice wherever you are. To contact us and be a part of the show, email thh@radiomaria.ca. We now continue with the program. Here once again is your host, Cathy Biase.
Welcome back to the Health Hub. We are having a really interesting conversation with Dr. Will Haas this morning. Cellular health, its impact on longevity. And as we left off, we talked about areas of the body areas of cellular health that you would protocol differently, basically. Now, the pillars, from what I understand, of how you operate when it comes to cellular health are redox, detox, and energy. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah.
Especially redox, because I find that one to be the most complicated.
And sometimes that's the one that does trip people up. But I almost think about it in that order, where we need to kind of start with the detox before we think about redox, and then final is energy kind of spills into redox, but then repair. So let's kind of jump out of order if you don't mind, and we'll get back to the redox.
Okay.
So when I kind of think through tapping into the body's own regenerative capacity, the sequencing really kind of matters, which is why I said, hey, let's take a detour and talk about the detox first, because we need to lower the burden of things interfering with normal function, right? And some of which we've already talked about this morning, right? Again, the inflammatory load, the environmental toxins and stressors, the nutrient insufficiencies, the gut dysfunction, the toxic burden, right? And these aren't just wellness trends, right? We have to remove what's blocking normal biology so the body can get clear signals. Right? We talked a lot about cellular communication and signaling. Right? Well, it can't get those clear signals if they're working in an inflammatory milieu. Right? If they're surrounded by toxins. Right? So that's kind of this whole concept of detox before really going after redox and repair. Right? And those protocols can be widely varied based upon what we're seeing with a patient. Right. So
Are they supplement driven, those protocols?
my practice, it's usually not just supplement, right? It's usually a combination of everything. And kind of it's one part lifestyle, whether that be things like stress management or nutrition. And then it may include supplements. It may include, peptides. It may include hyperbaric oxygen therapy or IV nutrient therapies. So let's just take a topic, for instance. Let's go with gut dysfunction. All right. So kind of get a 43-year-old female who kind of comes in. Same kind of a lot of the symptoms we've been talking about, where we get brain fog and weight gain, and lo and behold, they're having bloating after every meal, and you have a bowel movement once a week, right? So we start looking at their gut dysfunction and find that they have an overgrowth of bacteria in their small intestines, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, right? Well, let's say if you had that SIBO and the dysbiosis, and you layer on top of the fact that they have some environmental toxins, be it mold or heavy metals in the body. Well, one of the body's main detox pathways is the gut. And by a process of kind of what we call biotransformation of things getting packaged up in the liver and then sent to the gut to be pooped out. Well, if you're not having regular bowel movements, that process kind of gets stalled, right? And so we have to go after fixing that gut dysfunction before we could then go off and repair the patient's kind of constipation and gut issues. So that may look like doing an elimination diet.
Hmm.
That probably involves some supplements to your point, Kathy, right? I'm going to be using some different herbals and botanical supplements to try to kill out and weed out some of the bad bacteria that is producing hydrogen and methane gas, leading to the bloating and creating inflammation in the gut and breaking down the cells of the intestines, creating leaky gut, leading to nutrient insufficiencies. And then we may come alongside and use some oral peptides to then kind of heal and seal and do some of the repairing of the gut. And then if they've had significant enough nutrient insufficiencies, because this has been going on so long and they had leaky gut and their gut was not absorbing the nutrients they need, we may bypass the gut for a little bit and use some IV nutrient therapies, very kind of targeted therapies. So now you can kind of see like a protocol that is coming out of what's the ultimate driver of cellular dysfunction for every unique individual patient.
Okay.
And
And
we kind
sorry,
of,
go ahead.
yeah, we kind of started touching on some of the redox and repair piece, right? So, redox is kind of restoring that cellular communication. And to your point, that's, often the area that people haven't heard as much about, right? And it's about how the cells regulate inflammation and produce energy and communicate with one another.
Yeah,
And
it's a complicated process.
yeah, and there's a lot that goes into it, and it dives really deep into the weeds of the cellular medicine between stuff that we many of us who spent time in science classes at some point in time learned about the Krebs cycle, right?
Hmm.
And learned about the powerhouse of the cells, but there's so much more that's involved in that process. And in that process of producing energy, right? This is the yin and yang we talked about earlier, that by producing energy, you actually create oxidative stress,
Right.
right? And so if you go in this state of excess any energy production left unchecked, right, you could actually create more oxidative stress in the system. And so that's why this balance is very, very important. And that balance gets disrupted through, again, what we just talked about, stress, toxins, poor sleep,
Hmm.
right? So the body loses its ability to kind of self-correct during that phase, which is why that phase is so focused on evidence-based approaches for mitochondrial support and oxidative stress management and metabolic signaling. Um, I know that was your big one that you wanted to describe. Did that bring a little bit more clarity
It
to the
did. It
redox
did.
failure?
Yeah. But I've tried to study, and it's not easy. Um,
I mean, just
I suppose that when we're talking about all of this, you're keeping a close eye on the liver.
liver's going to have a, it kind of depends on what area, but liver's going to have a lot to do with my kind of the way I think through of it of detox and some redox, right? So the liver has lots of different functions, right? So the liver is partly responsible for the kind of production and maintenance of energy through gluconeogenesis, the production of blood sugar and the storage of blood sugar, right? It also was very important for detoxification, right? So I was kind of alluding to the liver's job of what we call stage one and stage two deconjugification, which is the whole process of basically taking bad stuff and binding it and changing it in such a way that it can be kind of carried out through the stool,
Hmm.
right? Through bile, right? So it can be bound up to bile, and then we can clear the bile out through our stool. And so, as I think through cellular health, I put a lot of emphasis on the liver's detoxification function. But also depends on what they're struggling with, right? So let's say the patient, again, going back to a very unique presentation, let's say the patient has healthy digestion and but they have very high levels of visceral body fat, that dangerous inflammatory fat that's stored in and around our body organs like our liver. So if the liver is suddenly packed with visceral body fat, Now it's likely that we probably have a redox problem and the ability and the body struggling with the management of blood sugar and lipids and cholesterol. Right. So how I need to support the liver in that case is going to be very different. And I might be focusing a little bit more on redox capacity with that patient.
Got it. I want to move on to a question that I was been wanting to ask since the beginning of the show. Does cellular regen, and this is tying into this area of zombie cells or senescent cells, does cellular regeneration slow down as we age, or do cells become overloaded and not functioning properly, and therefore that is the path to aging?
I think our understanding of that is continuing to evolve. And my understanding is more of the latter, right?
That's hopeful.
It's the it's when this balance is disrupted, right? We spent so much time talking about what disrupts that balance. You know, some of it can be aging, but I think so much of that is the imbalance that we kind of create through the stress and toxins and poor sleep and poor diet, right? That accelerates that whole process, right? That creates more stress on the cells. The cells have to work harder in those scenarios, right? So, create a bunch of inflammation within the body because we overload it with processed carbohydrates that then ultimately lead to increased deposition of visceral body fat. All right. And now we have insulin dysregulation or insulin insensitivity. Then now you're kind of kicking off this cascade where you have more inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction, and now the cells kind of get stuck and can't repair and regenerate themselves. All right. And then that accelerates the aging process because the whole kind of concept of that zombie cell that you talked about is it's not this kind of harmless cell that sits off to the side in a timeout penalty box where you're just like, yeah, I'm not gonna grow, I'm not gonna, recycle, I'm just gonna hang out over here. It actually gets really rowdy in that penalty box. It starts kicking out inflammatory cytokines, right? It's basically creating havoc in and around its environment and the cells near it, and just kind of making the environment overall worse and further disrupting that cellular balance and repair process that we talked about. So it's kind of that imbalance creating these zombie cells, which then accelerates the whole process even further.
Can they be removed or reversed?
Yes, and this kind of the concept of why so many of the fundamentals that we talked about in the first segment of our conversation, right? Some ways to kind of activate the AMPK lever, right? Which is fasting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Periods of fasting have been kind of known to kind of kick these cells into autophagy or the kind of this cleanup and repair, right? Resistance exercise training has been shown to do that, right? There are kind of compounds that we refer to as senolytics that can do the same thing. I would argue probably not quite as powerful as some of the lifestyle interventions, but things like resveratrol, right, would be an example of like a senolytic therapy. And there are some peptides that are believed to have the same properties as well. Something like MOD-SC in the example of our patient with visceral body fat and insulin resistance. So there are tools under our influence, both kind of lifestyle and cellular medicine tools that can enhance that process of autophagy and cleanup of the zombie cells.
Okay. Within your practice, within your methods, the bioregenesis method, how does this differ from other longevity protocols, would you say? The big picture.
Really, just it's my naming to the approach of what we've talked about today, right? And it's just it's a construct in which I can communicate with my patients some pretty complex topics that we tried to cover today articulate in such a way that you can kind of start to grasp them a little bit more. So the bioregenesis method is this approach to address detoxification with the cell, restore cellular communication and redox balance, and then activate regeneration and repair pathways. And thinking through that. So many of my patients will come to me so focused on the activate, regenerate, repair path, process, right? We're using these peptides and this hyperbaric oxygen, and what about stem cells, and what about this supplement? And it's going way downstream and not focusing totally on the upstream. And so it's my way of helping my patients kind of understand the approach that we talked about today.
And how quickly can one of your patients expect to feel, I guess, a shift when it comes to their cellular health?
Depends on how much they're doing alongside me, right? If I'm having to work against a diet and a lifestyle and no exercise, it can take longer, right? I'd say when things are all working in concert, I really start to see some shifts within 90 days.
Are your hardest challenges with, we talked about high performance people that you work with. So you're dealing with NFL players and you're dealing with professional athletes. Does it take a longer time to get the shift within an athletic group?
Hmm. I'd say it has to do more with how much dysfunction there is at a cellular level, right?
Okay.
And not all athletes are going to be the same, just like not all working professionals with families are going to be the same, right? So, an athlete who is eating fast food and staying up all night and, is going to be very different than an athlete who is getting regular, consistent 8 hours of sleep during the same sleep intervals and windows, and doing a balance of nervous system work and maybe yoga and Pilates alongside their strength training and hit exercise intervals. That's going to be very different. The same way a 40-year-old who also goes to sleep at 10 o'clock every night and isn't sitting on their laptop up until the last moment before they go to bed, and is eating a low carb, well balanced protein and fat diet. Very different than the person who stays up until 1 o'clock in the morning and has a Coke in the morning, along with hash browns, right? Very different phenotypes and very different individuals in the same kind of pocket of patients. So I can't lump them all the same.
Fair, fair. Now, you opened the door for me to talk about the nervous system, which is a real interest of mine. How does the nervous system directly influence cellular health? And can you optimize, do your protocols properly? Can you optimize your cells if your nervous system is constantly under stress?
No, no, you can't, because it's one part of the communication pathway. And you talked about hormones earlier on, and sex hormones get a lot of attention, but cortisol, it's a really important hormone that regulates the nervous system. Similarly, we have kind of the um, parasympathetic nervous system, where you have kind of the vagus nerve and its ability to create kind of this rest and relaxation. You have this balance of catecholamines, kind of like this adrenaline-based response, right? So if you're constantly in the state of fight or flight and your catecholamines are kind of kicked off, and that keeps your cortisol elevated and your vagus nerve not being activated, then the nervous system is kind of always stuck in a high alert mode, right? And you kind of get stuck, and then that can, you know, prevent the resolution of inflammation in the body. That is going to keep a state of oxidative stress that keep the mitochondria from kind of being healthy and creating energy. So now you can start to see how it's kind of spilling over into other areas. We know the biggest connection between the nervous system and the body that we've discussed already today is the gut, right? How many times do we see patients who say, "Hey, my gut symptoms seem to be worse. I have more irregular bowel movements during periods of high stress. So there's a direct correlation there.
Okay. Now, as we approach the end of the show, maybe you can give us, I don't know, 3 things or one big habit that, people can take away from our discussion today that would give them the biggest return on their energy levels, on longevity. If they could just start with 1 or 2 things, what would that be?
I mean, I'd love to talk about all the cool cutting edge technologies that we use in our office, but it's going to come down, I think, to a diet and sleep, in my opinion, or I'd say kind of diet and circadian rhythm regulation. And on the diet front, we're trying to basically leverage the right foods at the right windows, right? So a combination of kind of controlled carbohydrate diet with adequate amount of protein and phytonutrients. So as that breaks down, that means, not having carbohydrates to be the primary macronutrient, having, people can argue how much protein intake, but at the bare minimum, I'd probably say you're looking at 1 gram per kilogram, 1.2 gram per kilogram of a body weight, right? So the average individual, needs to be kind of closer between 80 to 120 grams of protein a day, whereas I see people that first come to my office are like 50, right? And that's going to control a lot of mitochondrial health. It's going to control a lot of what we talked about at a cellular level, the balance between growth and repair, mTOR and AMPK. And then the circadian rhythm, right? Sleep's important, but the timing of sleep cycles that we've already kind of talked about or alluded to earlier, right? Which is consistent sleep windows synced with the environment around us, right? So that's not saying you should go to bed every night at 2 o'clock in the morning and get up at 11 o'clock at night. But, going to bed within a 3-hour window from sunset, when sun kind of goes down, and not blast yourself with blue light during those 3 hours between then and when you jump into bed, and then getting that first light in the morning, because we didn't talk about this, and we probably don't want to dive too far into it in the last few minutes we have, but all of our cells kind of have their own natural rhythm and cycles to them, right? It's not just about sleep. The cells themselves are based upon these circadian rhythms in our body. So it's really important that we stay in tuned with those. So not so sexy, but
doable.
Circadian rhythms and diet.
Yeah, but doable, and we keep coming back to these similar things for our overall health. Thank you so much for being on the show. Now, if people want to get a hold of you, if they want to find out more about what you do, where would you direct them?
Best place is to go to VYVE Wellness, VYVE Wellness.com. And then just navigate to the top corner of the website and get started. We offer a free discovery call to learn a little bit more about the practice. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show today. Great conversation. I learned a lot. Absolutely. Pleasure to be here, Cathy. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you next week on The Health Hub.
You have been listening to The Health Hub, hosted by Cathy Biase, here on Radio Maria Canada.